So I'm a second year PhD student. I'm finishing my second year now. And my project is about how to encourage natural behaviors in captive parrots. So of course, this is ongoing research, but I already have some results and some findings that I'll be sharing today. So let's start with the enclosure design tool, which is a web application created by the University of Birmingham and partners. And the idea is to help captive facilities like zoos and sanctuaries comparing the behavior of their animals with their wild counterparts. So you collect behavioral data on the captive individuals, you upload those data into the DDT, and then the DDT gives you a comparison with available data from the wild. And it also tells you how to improve the enclosure in order to encourage the behaviors that are found missing. Now, the DDT is already up and running for great apes like chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, but we want parrots next. So the next step is to create an extension for parrots. So parrots. By parrots, I mean all birds of the order Psittaciformes, which include many popular species like budgerigars and macaws and cockatoos. Parrots are very popular in human care, not only in zoos, but as pets. But over 25% of all parrot species are threatened with extinction. And the main threats are habitat loss and the illegal pet trade. Now, parrots are also very intelligent, very cognitively advanced. In the wild, they live in very complex environments. And in captivity, they often develop what we call undesirable behaviors, like repetitive behaviors, feather plucking, and these are often indicative of poor welfare. So, captive breeding. Captive breeding can be a lifeline for all those threatened parrot species because parrots are often managed as part of insurance populations in zoos. And these insurance populations can be used for reintroduction programs to restock the wild. And many species have already benefited from captive breeding programs. However, long-term captivity can cause loss and modification of natural behaviors, can cause changes in morphology, and if we don't mitigate these problems, then the success of reintroduction programs may be jeopardized. So we want to encourage natural behaviors in captive animals because we want them to be, their behavior to be as close to their wild counterparts as possible. We want their morphology to be similar to their wild counterparts so we can facilitate any future reintroduction programs. Also, from a welfare perspective, captive animals should be given the opportunity to express natural behaviors. So we want to encourage them to express these behaviors because it's also beneficial for their welfare. Note that welfare in captivity is a very complex issue that involves a lot of variables, but they fall outside the scope of this study. This study, we focus on natural behaviors. So, partners and species. I have two zoo partners in my project, Wildlife Reserve Singapore, Jurong Bird Park, and Drayton Manor Theme Park and Zoo in the UK. They've both been incredible partners, very supportive of this study. In terms of species, I've got three main species included in this study. The scarlet macaw from Central and South America. It's not globally threatened, but some of its populations are threatened. The African grey parrot, which is endangered in the wild, and the swift parrot, which is critically endangered in the wild and is from Australia. Just sharing some of the results I've already got. I'm still collecting baseline data. This is ongoing, but I've already got some results. So if you look here at this graph, starting with graph A, on the left of the vertical bar, you can see the activity budget of 5 scarlet macaws. And the activity budget is what the animal does throughout the day, really. To the right of the bar, you can see data from the wild on captive bred yet released individuals, and then on juvenile wild scarlet macaws. Note that this is not ideal for comparison, but I'm still searching for the exact wild data that I want for comparison. So this is the best possible situation. On graph B, we have the gray parrots in one of the zoos, the gray parrots in all of the zoos. And then on the wild side, we've got the yellow-fronted parrot in the wild, which is very, very closely related to the African gray, and it's quite appropriate for comparison. And the main things that stand out from these graphs is that captive individuals spend more time perching or inactive. So they spend more time doing nothing than their wild counterparts. they spend less time feeding and less time socializing. So these are the main things that we found in both species. Enclosure use, these are just some examples from some of the individuals. And what stands out is that they don't use all the enclosures. So they spend a lot of time in one or two sections of the enclosure and ignore the others. Some of them spend too much time on the ground. Some of them don't use the top of the enclosure too much. And therefore the enclosure is not being fully utilized. There's not a lot of potential there that is not being used. Food and object manipulation. So parrots in the wild have to spend a lot of time manipulating food, searching for food. And in captivity, we found that they don't spend a lot of time in complex manipulation. The manipulation they do in captivity is very basic and not representative of the wild. Also, the objects they engage with are mostly permanent rather than novel or new, and destructible. So very easily destructible that they can destroy within seconds with their beak. Also, in the wild, they spend a lot of time using their feet to manipulate food. In captivity, under 50% of feeding observations were the food was used. And in some individuals, we barely saw them using their feet for manipulating food or objects. Locomotion, flight rates here on the left. So this is the total hours of observation for each individual. And these are the flight rates. So under 10 flights per hour in all individuals. Most of the flights, as you can see with this green, are under 6 meters, so really short flights. And in 2 of them, of course, we didn't see any flights at all. So that's something definitely to be encouraged. We also saw that the individuals used the wire mesh a lot, so what is around the enclosure, they used a lot as a support. Some of them spent a lot of time on the ground, and there was no diversity in perch use. They mostly used stable, horizontal, and thick perches, which again is not what they do in the wild. In terms of social behavior, like I said before, they spend far less time socializing than in the wild. Out of the social behaviors that we saw, most of them were allopreening, so when they preen each other. In the scarlet macaws, in the gray parrots, we saw some nibbling, which is when they affectionately nibble each other, and allopreening as well. In terms of proximity to other individuals, most of the times they were within 2 meters of at least part of the group. However, close proximity within wing length was really rare, which suggests that the bonds between individuals may not be very strong because they don't spend a lot of time really close together. So what can be improved and what we're recommending to the zoos to change in enclosure in order to improve these specific problems. So we definitely want to increase activity levels in the captive individuals. They spend most of their time inactive, and this can be a potential sign of a negative state. May mean that they're not motivated, they don't have much to do. We want to maximize enclosure use. We have an enclosure with several sections, and we want them to use most of it rather than fixating in one section. We want to decrease ground use because parrots in the wild, these 2 species, are arboreal. They spend most of the time on the trees where they're safe from predators, and ground is actually quite dangerous in the wild for parrots. So we want to decrease the amount of time they spend there. We want to increase the use of top of the enclosure because again, in the wild, they spend most of their time really high up on the trees. Yes, the enclosure is not as high as the tree, but we want them to at least use the top section of it. Of course, we want to increase manipulation challenges. They are very cognitively advanced, and therefore we want them in captivity to have the opportunity to engage in this manipulation that is challenging, it's advanced. We want to give them more novel and tough objects like they do in the wild, and like I said, we don't observe that in captivity. And we want them to increase foot use because in the wild they use their feet a lot to manipulate food and objects, and in captivity we are not observing that at all. Finally, we also want to increase flight rate because, of course, parrots fly a lot in the wild. They need to go over large distances to look for food, and in captivity, they're not doing it. We want to decrease wire mesh use because the wire mesh is very stable, very homogeneous, and it's not really challenging to climb on like they do in the wild. So we want them to use less the wire mesh and more structures within the enclosure. And we want to increase diversity of perch use, because in the wild, they don't only use the very stable, thick horizontal perches. They use perches that are quite wobbly and they have to reach the food by climbing on them. We want different orientations. And finally, we want to strengthen social bonding, because we want them to spend more time engaging in social behaviors and closer to each other like they do in the wild. Just to give an overall on what stage I'm on. So I've been collecting baseline data and I still have to finish it for some species. I've already sent modification proposals to the zoos, but I still have to finish that for some species. And then I will go back to the zoos to collect more data after the modifications have been applied. And then I will, of course, analyze those data and conclude whether the modifications work and whether the behavior of the captive animals is more similar to their wild counterparts or not. And ultimately, we want, of course, an EDT extension for parrots. That's the aim. So as a summary, there are several improvement priorities that we found. We proposed modifications to the zoos. There are exciting opportunities to naturalize the behavior of zoo parrots, but remember that this is ongoing research. So please stay tuned for future updates. And if you have any questions or any feedback, feel free to email me at any time. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching.